Now, the State House Chamber has not taken up its version of the bill yet. And while the Parkland shooting has focused our attention on school violence, everyday gun violence takes the lives of thousands of Americans. Here to distill the facts is David Kennedy. He's the director of the National Network for Safe Communities at John Jay College. So welcome, David.
Afternoon.
So there's all this talk, wall-to-wall coverage about these mass shootings. But you believe that the number of people who are killed when you compare mass shootings versus urban violence, not the same at all.
Well, not the same, and at this point, often in this, people get into a tug of war about which matters the most. That's a bad conversation. The point is, they're different, right? So doctors talk about cancer, of course they do, but really they talk about breast cancer and lung cancer and pancreatic cancer and prostate cancer. Gun violence is the same way. They're different. So, you know, we're in New York City, and over 15 years ago, the towers were attacked, and that day about 3,000 people died. What's true is that essentially every single year in ordinary urban gun violence, about the same number, about 3,000 of young black men are killed by guns, mostly in utterly ordinary urban circumstances.
So I want to highlight that for a second. You're saying, and when you look at the number of people who were killed during 9/11, about 3,000, and that defined the last decade, last 2 decades, that same number of people is killed every year in urban violence in America.
So that's the fact. I don't actually think it's the number that defined the last 15 years. I think it is the terror that defined the last 15 years. Terrorism is designed to terrorize. The spree shootings terrorize people, and that's real, and it's felt now all over the nation. It's also true that those killings represent typically under 1% of the gun violence body count every year.
When you say those killings, you're talking specifically about
the school shootings, the spree shootings, the active shooter situations, right.
And when you compare the rest of those shootings, what accounts for the bulk of them? Just to be really clear.
The grinding, everyday violence visited upon historically oppressed minority neighborhoods across these United States.
Gun violence.
Gun violence.
So when we look at this debate, banning rifles, is that likely to make a difference for this everyday violence as well?
This is one of the ways in which gun violence is different in different settings. So we're looking at the AR-15s because of the spree shootings. You don't basically ever find an AR-15 on a Chicago street. I mean, you do, but it's very unusual. That's everyday, ordinary handguns. It's not exotic. They're not big magazines. They're all over the place, and no, an AR-15 ban would not touch that problem.
So it wouldn't touch the problem. You're telling me that the majority of victims of gun violence are not killed or wounded in mass shootings, and yet there's so much talk about these rifles. What would be a better approach?
You and yours should stop talking about them.
Well.
No, I mean, I'm very serious. We know now that, like a bunch of other things we know about, suicides, hijackings, the school shootings especially are being carried by information. If you look at the guys who do this, and of course they're all guys, they study the prior events, they look at the kind of coverage. You shoot up your school, you're going to be on the front page of the newspaper and cable news for the next month. They compete with each other to get the higher body counts. This is being driven by information and 24/7 news coverage and social media and the contagion of that behavior.
So why do you think that everyday gun violence is not getting the same attention? I know you put it on us saying that we're focusing too much on these mass shootings, but when you have events which are spectacularly tragic happening at one moment and so many people, it's easy to understand why we would focus on that.
It is, but it is also the case that those are victims that you are listening and watching public care about.
That's interesting.
And the fact is that for the most part, dead black kids are not of a lot of public or political interest in this country.
So there's a bigger issue here at play.
There's a much bigger issue.
How do we change that? What's the message that we need to send, not only to the media, but also to the power brokers, to the politicians, to the ones who have their finger not just on triggers, but on the pulse of what's happening?
I'm not sure that there's much that we can do about this. I see what's happening right now out of Parkland and related activism. It's the kids who are finding their voices, and they are saying we are not going to accept this as normal, and now the adults are paying attention.
It's interesting to note those kids are, by and large, fairly affluent when you consider that community. If this was a poor, predominantly black or Latino school, do you think they would have had the same type of political power?
So I've been doing this kind of work for 30 years, and the communities that I'm committed to and that I work in get given the same bad rap all the time. People from the outside say, why don't they find their voices? Why don't they care about this? And if you work in them, and if you know the folks who live there and who are terrified, they have found their voices for a very long time. The outside world is not listening to them.
Why are we not listening to them? You know, our broadcast focuses on a lot of these underrepresented stories. We reach out to a lot of folks in the black diaspora, not just here in the USA, but around the world. What is different? How can they tell their story differently so that more people can pay attention?
I don't think it's on them to tell their story differently. They are eloquent about their story. People don't really care.
So how do we reframe this? Because I get what you're saying. So people don't care. And yet you have all these teens and young people who are dying in this gun violence. And yet you have this case in Florida where they're doing something. Are you telling me that what they're doing in Florida is the very same as what a lot of the victims of gun violence are doing? Or are they doing something differently? That's what I'm trying to get at.
They're doing something that the rest of the world is paying attention to. I mean, it really does not come down to the actions of oppressed and violated communities. They know their own stories, and they're very good about telling them. Getting an audience is something different. A friend of mine who's also activist in all this, named Michael McBride, is a pastor from the Bay Area. He was called into the White House as part of then Vice President Joe Biden's gun violence task force after the Newtown shootings, and said very clearly in those rooms, as we've been discussing, there's the white school kind of problem and there's the urban problem. And numerically, my community's dead vastly outnumber that other community's dead, which is just a fact. Why aren't we talking about my community's dead? And the response from the political professionals was, we don't really think there's political interest in that.
So no one has the political will to stand up for the larger body of victims, which, based on what you're telling me, are not victims of these mass shootings, but instead of the everyday crime and shootings that affect mostly non-white people.
The only attention to that urban problem in the last little while has come when, as you know, there's been a debate in the last couple of years about whether there's been an increase in homicide in American cities. And the issue there, I mean, it's important whether or not there's an increase, but that's what the entire conversation about. The communities that saw what might have been that increase, the national homicide rate is now at about 5 per 100,000 every year. Young black men in those communities are being killed year in and year out at rates over 500 per 100,000, which then may have gone up a little bit. The debate was entirely about whether it went up a little bit, not about the day-to-day reality, which is they are dying at a rate more than 100 times those of other Americans.
Thank you so much, David Kennedy. Dying at a rate of more than 100 times of ordinary Americans. David Kennedy from the National Network for Safe Communities. Thank you.